my name's Femi, as was just said. Bromsgrove has been in my DNA since I was 9. I took part in the church on Broad Street, New Song. I'm a Bromsgrove boy. And I'm currently working for the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna. And the essence of me coming here is essentially saying, if you want to stop Brexit, you need to put me in a room with Corbyn. Basically, I studied EU law. Well, I studied law, which covered a lot of EU law, and it was incredibly painful for me to watch the debate going on and see just a complete absence of facts. Essentially, you have a decision which is resulting in us leaving the single market, and people on both the Remain and the Leave side, most people couldn't tell you what the single market actually is. Most people think that it's just a general trade deal, that it's similar to tariff-free access, no tariffs on goods that come in. That's not even close. Essentially, if you imagine, and I've said this on Twitter many times, imagine if you wanted to sell beer to every country, well, to 28 different countries, 27. These countries have different legislations. The laws in this country might be different to the laws in another country. One country might say beer has to have a certain percentage of alcohol in order to be called beer, to be marketed as beer, whatever beer is in that language. So that would mean I'd have to market, manufacture, and package my product in 28 different ways. That messes up my marginal costs, it messes up my profits, it makes it harder for me to compete with the companies in that country because they don't have to adapt their product in 28 different ways. They can make one version of their product and sell it as they can in their country. What the EU did was harmonization, mutual recognition. Harmonization means the EU comes up with a rule and says all of the 28 countries, for example, beer, this is the percentage that you need to have to be called beer. Or they come up with another rule, and it depends on the products, which is called mutual recognition, which means that if beer meets the requirements to be called beer in the UK, you can sell it in the same way in another country, even if their laws are different. Which means we can sell our products across the EU in exactly the same way. Now, if we were to leave the EU, leave the single market, that would mean that our companies would have to adapt our products to each member state, whereas companies in those countries wouldn't have, will still have the same advantages. They'll be able to sell it in exactly the same way, which means they'll be able to sell their products cheaper, they'll be more competitive, and that's also why our prices have been rising, because many of our products are part of supply chains that start in Europe. Now, if we increase the cost of selling to Europe and exporting, that sort of cost can be absorbed by companies with large profit margins, the large multinationals, the very sort of companies that Brexiters were trying to stick one up for in terms of Brexit. And so, if I understand that Jeremy Corbyn's idea of socialism is let's not have unlimited inflow of workers because that will increase competition for the lowest paid jobs. And so one might think that that must mean we must leave the single market because one of the 4 freedoms is free movement of persons. However, if our pound has gone down, if the pound has fallen, that means that the value, the worth of that minimum wage is lower. And it means that the prices in the high street are higher. That messes up poor people. That's exactly the sort of people that Jeremy Corbyn is trying to protect. If we make it more expensive to trade, that benefits the large multinationals. Well, it doesn't benefit them, but it gives them an advantage over small companies that can't afford to pay for the increased cost of work, or adapt to this global Britain drive where corner shops and small and medium-sized businesses are supposed to export to Japan, to the Commonwealth, to South America. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't help the small and medium-sized companies that Jeremy Corbyn thinks he's trying to help. His idea of socialism isn't being applied properly to the EU. Now, as I said, I'm on Twitter. In January last year, I wasn't on Twitter. I had an account, but it had about 20 tweets total. I was very much a Facebook boy. But since Brexit became a thing, I realized if I want to avoid the echo chamber, because all of my friends were Remain, I needed to get public. And so I grew from about 20 followers last year to 5,700 now. Why? Because I can explain the single market. And as well as explaining the single market, which apparently Remain didn't feel the need to explain to people, I've been taking on people. I've been taking on Nigel Farage specifically, and there's now 3 videos which are now fairly viral of me demolishing him on his own radio show. For example, I think the first one was I basically explained the single market to him, and I also pointed out that because it was at the time of the elections, I pointed out that he said that I'm going to be an MP. I'm going to be an MEP rather than an MP. Why? Because of all the speaking time I can get and all the influence I can have. And I pointed out to him that that's exactly the point. That we have 73 of the 750 MEPs in the European Parliament. That's 10%, even though we're one of 28 countries. That's a significant pull. That's the power that we're losing by leaving the EU. And I pointed out that his decision not to be an MP points out exactly why we shouldn't be leaving. The second one, I pointed out how his entire Brexit agenda was based on anti-globalization, yet he's the one who's brought about global Britain. So that doesn't make sense because it screws the very people that he was supposed to be protecting. And the third one, which is the one that's gone mega viral, which is where we discussed immigration, that wonderful topic that Nigel seems to love so much. And I made the point that he told everyone that it's the EU who has its open border policy that is letting in everybody, and that we need to take back control of our borders. Now, under EU law, citizens' rights, Article 7, it says, in order to come here without a job, you need to have sufficient resources to not become a burden on the social assistance system of the host country. That means you can't come here and simply live off benefits. You can't come here unless you can support yourself without automatically relying on benefits, which completely undoes his narrative. And when he said this, yes, he said, but countries don't tend to do this. No, they do. I currently live in Vienna, and I've lived in Brussels before that. All of them required me to register and to say what my job was and to say what my income was. So other countries are doing it. We are not. So I asked him, so who do we blame? Do we blame the EU for providing the rules that would allow us to restrict immigration, or do we blame the UK government that hasn't been imposing restrictions that were provided by the EU? To which he had zero answer, hence the virality of that video. So my point is, we need to better explain what the EU is, what the single market is, and explain to Jeremy Corbyn that essentially his idea of socialism, I love Jeremy Corbyn. I love that he sticks to his principles, that he has these very strong principles of socialism, helping the little guy for the many, but essentially that's not how it works in practice. And what he's doing is messing things up for the many. And for the everyday person, he's essentially going along with a global Britain agenda. Globalization, the very thing that he claims to be against, he's going with it. But yes, clearly I have a lot of things to say. But thank you very much for listening.
If anyone's got any questions about the EU or anything that Femi's talked about, I'm sure you're happy to answer them. And
in fact, during the referendum, I actually made a T-shirt saying "EU questions, just ask." I was stood in the middle of the bullring and in the middle of the town square. So please ask.
Yeah, going back to the referendum, is it your belief that people who voted to leave didn't know what they were voting for, but the people who voted to remain were fully informed and did know what they were voting for?
Not at all. Not at all.
So which is it? Who acknowledged?
I don't think anybody did.
Remainers?
I don't think anybody did. I think if you ask most Remainers what the single market is, they wouldn't be able to give you an accurate answer. Because me personally, despite everything I've just said, if I hadn't studied the EU law, I wouldn't know any of this. Not one politician, not one journalist has accurately explained what the single market is. I think the arrogance on the Remain side of we're the ones who know what we're talking about isn't well founded, because if you can't explain the single market, then you can't explain whether or not it's good to leave it or not.
Well, I think, could I say for people who did try to explain it, were shouted down and called all sorts of appalling names for their pains, economists, some of the economists who did try to raise their head above.
Yeah.
parapet,
We're,
and they were
one of the
severely
depth of
pushed down.
experts. Yeah.
But also, I think, although I agree that Jeremy could do more in many ways, he's walking a tightrope because he's trying, unfortunately, to keep all of his members, voters, happy.
Yeah.
The ones who want to go, the ones who don't. But I think what the fault has been is that things, as you say, have not been made explicit enough with examples people can relate to, so they understand they're being carried away with these silly things
Well,
on
that's
the
why I
bus.
tend to use beer as an example.
Yeah. And he's, because what he actually said in his speeches, I thought, before the vote, the referendum, he was quite sensible, not fully, but he didn't explain enough, he didn't have enough other people explaining more. And the people who did try, my son's very Muslim, he tried, he was called some very, very rude names in the press for his pains, which, you know, nobody bothered to counter his arguments. He was advising members of parliament. Where do you go from there?
Can I ask? Thanks very much for the talk. I thought I understood the single market, but I clearly don't. And the bit that I'm struggling with is the mutual recognition, because I can understand the logic of harmonising products, or the thing that was portrayed as straight bananas and all that kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
So I can understand the logic of that for a supply across the continent. But you were saying, I think I understood the mutual recognition being that we as a country could sell products even though there was no standardisation if other members of the EU found that acceptable. Is that right? Can you just explain how it works?
Mutual recognition is in the areas that are less sensitive. So if the area is one which relates to health, then usually they'll go with the harmonisation route. Whereas if it's an area that doesn't necessarily have a lot of dangers associated with it, or it's not politically sensitive, I chose the beer example, one, because more people can relate to, and two because the original case was called Cassis de Dijon, where essentially one country was saying, in order to be marketed as, I can't remember what type of alcohol is Cassis de Dijon?
Blackcurrant.
Yeah. In order to be marketed as a liqueur, it needed to be of a certain percentage, and so it did this, and this is the reason why the single market exists, because countries will always protect their own industries. They will always try and make it so that just by the de facto, because of the nature of where that country is and the nature of the environment, that industries from their country have an advantage over external companies. So they might say it can't be marketed as this unless it contains X, which is only grown here, that sort of thing. And so with that, they decided that okay, you can still market it as liqueur if it meets the requirements of your home country.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I think my love or hate of the European Union took a bit of a hit in the last week, and it did when the referendum came up as well, and I think they're both legal issues that caused it. So the first one was the way the migrant crisis was dealt with, and the agreement with the other member states that they were dealt with at the border seems to collapse and caused a massive problem across Europe, and we're still suffering with that problem now, and more importantly the migrants and refugees are suffering even more, and it's not being dealt with properly. And then the second one is more recent, and it centres around Catalonia. And I'm not expert on European law, but I'm pretty sure Article 2 describes how the European Union was set up and the fundamental principles of it. And one of them is freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. Now, when you look at what's happening in Catalonia, whether you support independence or not, sending militarised police in to deal with ballot boxes isn't protecting democracy. So I don't understand why Article 7 hasn't been revoked. And is that because Spain's such a powerful voice within the European Parliament? In vote, sorry. And doesn't that highlight the problem with the European Union?
One of the point by point, immigration-wise, in terms of the refugee crisis, one of the problems with the debate in terms of refugees was that you had Nigel with his breaking point banner showing all the thousands of refugees coming in, and we have an opt-out. As far as asylum seekers go, not one asylum seeker can come into here on the back of EU law. Some of the other EU countries, yes, they are under common asylum rules, but the UK, Ireland, no. If a refugee comes into this country, it's because we say so. Leave Brexit or no Brexit, that doesn't change. So the entire narrative of leave the EU so that we can have control over refugees coming, false. If we're going to talk about illegal immigration, that's not a legal issue. Well, yeah, as in you can't blame EU law on illegal immigration. And in terms of how well they've been treated, yeah, it's a nightmare. There's not going to be ever a perfect solution. But as far as our membership or not of the EU, if we're worried about how refugees are being treated over there, then the best way to improve the EU's response to that is to be part of it and to be actively involved in the democracy of the EU. Withdrawing from the EU actually just, if we consider the way they're dealing with it to be wrong, actually is counterintuitive because it means we're letting go of the control that we had. Second point, Catalonia, which is being used as a way to bash the EU, even though those are the actions of a nation state, the very thing that Leavers are very, very clinging to. These are national actions. The referendum itself was illegitimate or illegal. The Parliament didn't vote for it, which means, and in order to have a referendum on Catalonian independence, you need in Spain it needs to be voted in Parliament, and it wasn't, which meant that de facto that referendum was illegal. Now, me personally, I believe that they should have the vote anyway. That there shouldn't be a mechanism that stops any group of people from having a vote on any issue, regardless of whether or not you want to call it illegitimate and not respect the result. That they have the right to say it. I mean, Brexit aside, we have the right to say it, to speak and to express our opinions. And so I find it, I don't want to use the word disgusting, I find it unacceptable that Spain went in as they did and was extremely violent with people simply expressing their democratic voice. As for the EU's response to that, they did condemn the violence, but you've got to also, it's a double-edged sword. We have Brexiters complaining that the EU hasn't stepped in. Which side is it? Do you want the EU to interfere where our laws say that something's illegal? If our democracies, we want the EU to be interfering in our internal democracy, the Brexiters would, if they did the other way, they'd complain the other way. You can't have it both ways. I believe, I mean, like I said, they did condemn the violence, and I think that's where they can go. But there are limits on what the EU can actively do. If it's against the laws of the national country, there's limits on what they can do.
Is it militarised force against subjects of a sovereign country?
It was the military police. I'm not sure where the line is.
But the next stage, though, is to shut down the parliament if they declare independence, and apparently there's 2 battalions of army reserves on a cruise ship in Barcelona harbour. So if that happened, then I think
if they start using proper military against the people, I think there would be proceedings brought. I'd be fairly confident that if they start did that, there would be proceedings brought. But again, this is the Commission has to think long term, as in, yes, a country may push the boundary, but they have to take a while before they go push the nuclear button, essentially, and say, all right, you're out.
Can I just say, does it not damage the credibility of the Spanish state, though, to have these pictures zoomed all around the world? I mean, irrespective of whether it was legal or not, there's a legitimacy that would be kind of recognised, even if it's not legal, it still could be legitimate. I mean, like, you could just point to South Africa, for instance,
Yeah,
legality,
exactly,
things like
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
So this is not a good advert for the Kingdom of Spain
yeah, I know.
around the world, and I think I feel that the EU, which I'm very pro, did let us down. It showed a kind of a lack of bottle here, because they were. How can you listen to the EU condemning other regimes in the future if they've simply sidestepped this particular one because it was uncomfortable?
The quote was that we should move quickly from violence to dialogue. Violence can never be used as a political tool. The EU point blank said violence has to stop. Whether or not they go into the specifics as to whether or not the people should have had a voice. Again, if it were to happen here, we'd say that they were interfering with our democracy. If, for example, Scotland, if the vote hadn't gone to support their democracy, and Scotland had tried to have a referendum without the approval of Westminster, and the EU had condemned us for stopping those ballot boxes, you'd have Scottish people, you'd have people in this country complaining that the EU is interfering with the unity of the United Kingdom. It's a very double-edged sword. You've got the rights to democracy on one hand, you've got national sovereignty on the other. Yeah.
It just looks so vicious.
Oh, it was. I was appalled.
Over the top. You know what I mean?
No. Forget image and how this looks for Spain. That's just immoral. You're clamping down people who are simply expressing their opinion.
You have to go back to the Spanish Civil War. I mean, that's where it's actually surfacing from. It's from the 30s, and it's all of that history coming back again.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you any question? Would you advocate a second referendum on Brexit?
I believe that simply saying we're calling a next referendum would get people's backs up. I think the best way to go about this is to essentially have a strong campaign of here are the facts that we're missing, and have people themselves calling for a second referendum. Have people saying, all right, have your negotiations. We'll have a look at the final deal. If we're going to end up worse off, which, let's be clear, what we're negotiating right now is tariff-free access, a basic free trade deal. As for anything above that, we start getting into single market territory. They've been tried to get mutual recognition agreements, but the EU seems to have shut that down up to this point. The ceiling on this thing is free trade deal, which is similar to the deal that the EU has with Canada. It's not single market access. And one of the ways people have been confusing, they say that no, access, not membership, the same thing. The access and membership are the same thing. What people mean when they say we've got access, like China has access, North Korea has access, what they mean is access to the European market in general, because as in the literal ability to trade with the EU. There's a difference between that and being able to trade under the same terms as in your home country, under the same laws, the same product requirement, that sort of thing. Sorry, your question again.
No, I just wondered whether you said whether you'd be for it.
Yeah.
No, I thought your beer description was very apt, because I used to run a small company, and we, the Amateur Swimming Association, endorsed our product. But then they turned around and said, but we wanted packaging differently. We were a startup company. Wasn't second order costs for us?
Exactly. And yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I honestly think that the EU is going to punish the UK as an example for other countries not to leave the EU. What's your opinion?
I personally believe that that'll be at the back of their minds. But there's the punishing element, and there's also the maintaining their own integrity element, as in, economic integrity. The whole reason why the people call the EU protectionist, and it is. The EU system does make it so that if you're in the club, you get to trade under the same rules. It means your profit margins go up, and that sort of thing. If we give the UK the same benefits as if they were in the single market, whilst not having any of the burdens, why would anyone else want to be in it? and that means if they can leave, yeah, it would undermine that, and we'd lose that protectionist bubble. The bubble works because there are enough people inside it to make it attractive. It's a market of 500 million people, and they're our biggest their biggest trading partner, between 40 and 50%. They are huge, and they work. I mean, in international trade terms, size is everything.
No, what I asked was, my opinion is that the EU is going to punish the UK for leaving, as an example, not to let any other country leave, like Greece or Portugal or one of these. And I asked your opinion, not about, the money and the club and everything. Do you think my opinion is right, that the EU is going to punish the UK, to give us a rough deal, as an example to other countries not to leave?
As I said, I think that will be at the back of their mind. I think if they give us a sweets deal, it would be an incentive to leave, which I think it's more on the side of not giving us rather than giving us a truly awful deal, because a truly awful deal would be essentially bad for the EU as well. They want to have a degree of market access, but they don't want to give us they want to give us standard market access, as in just basic a free trade deal. A free trade deal would work perfectly for the EU. They'd be able to still trade with us, and they still have the same advantages that I just mentioned over us. It's not in their interest at all to give us any sort of single market perks.
You don't think they'll give us a rough deal then?
They won't give us a terrible deal. I mean, I have tweeted in French to Michel Barnier, basically saying, please keep the status quo on the table, because if we get to the end of this and the UK, as I said, the UK is going to realise what it's done, and it's going to not want it. And at that point, if you then tell us, fine, you can come back in, but you'll lose all your perks. You lose your opt-outs on immigration, you'll lose the ability to keep the pound, blah blah blah. If they do that, even I wouldn't want to take it. I don't want to give up a pound. I've never taken the euro. I don't believe in the euro. I think you can't have monetary union without fiscal union. I don't think it works, and that's the reason why we have Greece. So I was saying that we need to. I know that essentially we're the annoying member of the family right now, but please look long term and keep that option of status quo on the table.
And you're basically backing Labour without being allowed to say I am Labour.
I'm backing Labour lefty principles, looking out for the many. Backing Labour, but right now that means backing Corbyn. And I think a strong message that needs to be sent is, Corbyn, the young people gave you this recent victory, and the young people voted to remain. If you keep on this path, you're going to lose us.
Can I just come to Jimmy first?
Well, talking about that being a young person, I voted Remain, fundamentally around the rhetoric that was going on at the time, the anti-immigrant, the racism. But the fundamentals of the union, I think they've been dragged around over and over and over again, and that's why there's evidence again to me and the things that really was about Greece. One was very society, and then the other one being how they reacted to the refugee crisis and all this. And one thing I always hear from experts when it comes to the EU is a lot of talk about the economics of the situation, but the fundamentals is all that loss. And I think that free movement has clearly worked for you, as it has for me when I've got in Israel and travelling about. But the Lithuanians that come to this country aren't going and working in all schools. The Lithuanians are in packing factories, or they're in the cherry farms being exploited. And I think that when you've got a global capitalist system which exploits people so readily and so rigorously, I can't silence those principles without being shown first. And I've left it a long time, and I'm still on the fence, I really am, because I want to believe in it. I want to believe in a global European system where we can work together and cohesively. But every single time, at every single level, I'm shown different. And I think that there's economic integrity, there's integrity around in terms of what the union is supposed to do. And I think that there's especially with the view of what World War II was, the collective memory around that, and still people are still arguing with through that. I know there's some people in this room without trying to come in, but I think that's been
No, I hear what you're saying. I mean, as for exploitation of workers, essentially we're dealing with it becomes a national issue because the minimum wage is the minimum wage. If we allow people to be exploited in this country, that's on us. As for just the basic principles and the fundamental rights of the EU, the founding treaties of the EU are the Treaty of the EU and the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, and in the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, and the EU Union themselves. So, human rights are the actual backbone of the EU. As for refugees and how they've been treated, again, there's no perfect solution. We've tried to impose the EU's tried to impose quotas on countries. It's tried to it's led refugee efforts. I mean, Frontex, for example, it's trying, but it's messing up. But I mean, to be callous, there was always going to be this was a crisis. Yeah.
Of course, but there's always limitations, isn't there? And there's the practicality around the situation as well, which bothers me. I find it difficult enough mobilising and getting ready for things that happen in Worcester because of the NHS. I can't keep contracts on my own as well. You know, I don't understand Europe. I did modules of it at university when I did journalism and law, and I thought I knew it then. And it kind of comes back every now and again in drips and drabs, but I haven't got the time to hold people to account in the way that I would probably like to, and so I think the whole democratic system that it operates, I think it's flawed.
You raise a good point, and that's another thing. The narrative of these unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. That narrative. If I could bring up the diagram, but essentially there are four main institutions of the EU. There's the European, and they're the titles are annoyingly similar. European Commission, European Council, Council of Ministers, and European Parliament. The European Commission is essentially 28 commissioners, each put forward by each country, and they have to be approved and selected by the Parliament and the heads of state of all the countries. And the European Parliament is directly chosen in the European elections. So you vote directly for your MEPs, and then they choose the commissioners, as does your heads of state. And they bring in the heads of state. The European Council is just the 28 different heads of state, and then you've got the Council of Ministers, which is, as the name suggests, Council of Ministers, national ministers. So if we're dealing with the topic of defence, if we're dealing with the topic of medicine, if we're dealing with health, for example, it'll be Jeremy Hunt. And they basically vote using those ministers on those issues, and then again the European Parliament. So the Commission is the least directly elected one, but they're basically being controlled by the Parliament and the heads of state of the different countries. So that's the most tenuous and the one that tends to get the most flack as far as democracy goes. But again, they're chosen by people that you elect. And one of the points that I make quite regularly is take Jeremy Hunt, for example. His constituency represents 0.1% of the population. Statistically speaking, in terms of the country, he's unelected, but yet he runs our health. All the problems of the health service, that's him, yet we didn't choose him. Not one person here was even on the ballot paper. Indirect democracy is part of democracy. So when I tell you that our people we elect choose the commissioners, it's not too dissimilar. And then you've got the heads of state in the European Council, who are heads of state who we vote for. European Council of Ministers, again, ministers who we vote for, and European Parliament MEPs, again, who we vote for. It's more work than if everything was at the national level, but I mean, following it isn't. Okay, that's not fair. I was going to say it's not that hard, but it was my job, so yeah. The European Commission, for example, has a live stream of the daily press briefing every day. You can follow all the committee meetings of the European Parliament online.
I just intervene there. We have to go online to follow the European Parliament proceedings, but if we were in France or Italy, we could see that on television.
Another thing, yeah.
chooses to give time and money to,
Exactly.
to showing what happens in the European
If
Union.
the UK media had shown us enough of what the European Union was doing for us, we wouldn't be here.
I was just going to say, one of the things it has done is challenge some of the global companies, particularly people like Amazon, etc.
Yeah.
And they've done it in a way which is proving beneficial. And I just wondered whether you feel the UK will be able to exercise that degree of leverage against those kind of companies.
No.
You raised the issue of human rights. Now, just seeking some information on it. I understood the UK government was at one time looking to develop its own Bill of Rights to replace the European. Where's that got to? I've lost track, really.
Pretty much, it's similar to the situation of Trump in healthcare at the moment, in the sense that we've got to the repeal place, but no replace. Because all we know is Theresa May wants to act on the Human Rights Act. She said it should be scrapped. She said that point blank. But we've seen nothing in terms of a replacement. And it's...
It may go the same way as the £300 a week was
But they could undo so much of what the EU set up.
And unfortunately, I'm going to break Godwin's law, adhere to Godwin's law. The EU was set up in response to the atrocities of the Second World War, and essentially that was a situation where the worst human rights abuses were committed against people deemed to be other, people deemed to be foreigners. And one of the reasons why Theresa May wants to basically undo the Human Rights Act is because of that it gives too much right to people who she considers to be outsiders. So, the moment we leave a body set up in response to the worst human rights abuses against people deemed to be foreigners, we're going to undo our human rights provisions because of foreigners. That is clichédly stupid.
Velma.
Yeah, Penny, I'm glad that you raised the origins of the EU, admittedly with 6 countries, and it's grown enormously since then. But we didn't, as Remainers, remind people of the values and the moral decisions underpinning that. I mean, I think the words of the Schuman Agreement are absolutely powerful. It was to make war materially unthinkable and materially impossible. And the role, I mean, I think people think it was all about trade, but trade was the how and not the why.
Exactly.
Trade was about, first of all, bringing the war industries, steel and coal, together, so they would be so closely intermingled that they couldn't make the weaponry of war. And I have huge problems with the way, in recent years, the EU has moved. I mean, I sympathise with much of what Jimmy has just said. And I think a lot of us have problems with how it has become, with moving much more to a conservative agenda in many ways. And I've been angry with how they've treated Greece and southern European countries, and then all the other things that have just been said. But for all that, if we're not in it, we can't actually get back to what it's really about. The fact that the EU has helped to bring democracy to some of those Eastern European countries, which wouldn't have been there, otherwise. And I think, for all my irritation with some of the excesses that I think have happened and are still happening, I can't turn my back on something that was set up with such a strong moral imperative to help towards peace in Europe, and therefore as a model for the rest of the world.
And isn't that exactly the same as the NHS, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Exactly the same. We look at the NHS as a principle, it's great.
Absolutely.
Then we look at our practical examples ourselves, and we can see where it's gone wrong and what it's doing wrong. But the principle still remains, doesn't it?
And we didn't, Remainers didn't remind people of that. We allowed the leavers to use all the emotions, and we tried to counter it with facts about the economy, which actually most people are not particularly interested in the detail. We didn't use the moral imperative, and we're still not doing it.
One of the things that has been a problem and also makes the Brexit referendum inevitable was that and even when I talk to people in Europe, they all say the same about our government. When it rains, it's the EU. When it's sunny, it's us. That's the government line that's been for the past 10, 20 years. And so when it comes to immigration, as I just explained, we had controls, we didn't use them, but still blame the EU. When it comes to fishery, again, that's a very strong blame the EU thing. Fishing quotas are basically calculated by environmental experts based on sustainable fishing, as in if you overfish, you get rid of the fish, you wipe out entire you wipe out the species in that area. You have to set quotas. So that's unavoidable, and they're established by environmental experts, and then that's transmitted to the Council of Ministers. So the fisheries ministers of each country are then the ones that decide who gets what. I.e., the fishing quotas are set by national ministers, yet we're blaming the EU. Then there's, things. As for the extent of the EU's power, there are limits